So I know some of the guys had to go because they had to work, and so I'm very fortunate that you guys are unemployed and don't have a job and can stick around for a little while and enjoy. But I promise, I always make this promise, and I never stick to it. To not speak too long. I was told 15 to 20 minutes because we do have to get back to work, and I have to get back on campus. But sometimes what ends up happening is that I get so inspired that I just go with it. So if I'm going too long, just tell me to stop, and I'll stop. Trust me, I'm not going to take any offense. If you were a kid, I take offense, but an adult, trust me, not at all. I get it. I run a little too long sometimes. And I have to tell you that the thing is that it happens to me all the time that I come into this talk that I'm going to give, and I have one idea, and all of a sudden I feel like the Holy Spirit takes me in a completely other direction. I'm going to tell you a quick story because it happened to me yesterday. Yesterday, unfortunately, last week my brother-in-law passed away. And a really young guy, 43 years old, my sister's husband, and he had been sick, so we're not surprised, but it still comes as a shock, obviously, when he passes away. And they had no children, which is a blessing, right? That they don't have children, so there are not kids out there without a father. But yesterday was the funeral mass, and so obviously I'm presiding the funeral mass. And I had been spending a couple of days thinking about what I was going to preach at the homily, and what I was going to say to my family, to my sister, to his family. His father had been the deacon over at Good Shepherd for many years, Deacon Arthur Merkel. It's a Panamanian family, and so what was I going to say? And those situations are always a little difficult. It's like. Funerals are sometimes very difficult to preach at, but I confess to you that funeral masses are also the ones that I enjoy celebrating the most for two reasons. Number one, because you got to give some sense of hope to people who have just lost someone that they loved. But also I like funerals because people are really focused. Like they're listening to you because they're thirsting for something. Weddings, that's a different story. Everybody's distracted, everybody's looking at the gown, everybody's looking at this, and does the groom have anything written in the back of his shoes and all that kind of stuff. Weddings are a pain. And the other thing I like about funerals is that they're permanent, unlike weddings sometimes, that they're not always permanent. Anyways, that was a little joke there, a little ministerial joke. Anyways, with that said, so yesterday I'm celebrating the funeral mass, and I had been thinking for a couple of days about what I was going to preach about, what I was going to say. There's only so much that you can say about death and resurrection and all that stuff. And over the past few years, what I've done is I've moved away from eulogizing the person who's passed. The vast majority of times, I don't know exactly who that person is necessarily. It may be the grandfather or the mother of somebody that I know, but I may not know the grandfather or the mother. And you always have to be a little bit careful because, after somebody's dead, they're awesome people, right? And so at one point I stopped and I said, you know what? Let the family members give the eulogy to talk about the individual. You're there because you need to talk about something much more important than the person who has just died. And I know that sounds a bit harsh, but if I talk to you about my brother-in-law, his life, and especially his death, can offer you no hope whatsoever. The only thing that could offer you hope is Jesus Christ and the fact that he rose from the dead. That's the only thing that could give you consolation in a moment like this. I tell people all the time, no doctor, no lawyer, no successful businessman can give you hope in a moment like this unless that doctor, that lawyer, and that businessman is a man of faith, right? Because what hope can a doctor give you if the person's dead already? What hope can a lawyer give you if that person's already passed? There's no amount of money that can replace that person. But let me talk to you about Jesus because that's what gives you hope, the fact that he rose from the dead and that he promised us, because he promised, it's all over the Bible, that's what the scripture is all about. He promised us that there is life after death, etc., etc. So I went into this mass with one idea of what I was going to say. And I told the deacon who was celebrating with me and reads the gospel, I said, Deacon, I want you to read this gospel. And it was the gospel where Jesus goes to Bethany because Lazarus has died. And Martha, his sister, says, Lord, I know that if you would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And Jesus responds by saying, your brother will rise, etc., etc., etc. Do you believe this? Martha says, yes, I believe that you are the Messiah, you are the one to come. And then Jesus says, Martha, he says to her, Martha, I am the resurrection. I am the life. Do you believe this, right? And then Martha says, yes, I believe. That's what I wanted him to read. Because what I was going to talk to them about was, that Jesus doesn't say, hey, Martha, I am going to resurrect. Jesus doesn't say that. Jesus doesn't say, Martha, I am going to resurrect. And therefore, if I resurrect, your brother's going to resurrect. The words of Jesus are not like that. The words of Jesus are, Martha, I am the resurrection. Not that I'm going to resurrect, but I am the resurrection. And that's why this phrase always comes back to me that says, the resurrection is not something that happens to you. The resurrection is someone who happens in you. That's the difference, right? Jesus refers to himself as the resurrection. You resurrect, but Jesus is the resurrection. Does that make sense? That's the line that I was going to go in. But the deacon messed up. He read another reading. And as the words are coming out of his mouth from the very beginning, I say to myself, coño, este tipo se ha equivocado. This guy is reading the wrong gospel. And I told him specifically, and inside of me, there is anger. Because my whole homily is now right out the window. And standing in the front row is my father. It's like, ¿qué vas a decir? Right? The kids are looking at me, and I'll be like, whatever, I'll pull something out of my hat. But my father, who's there going, ¿qué tú vas a decir? Porque tu hermana está triste. So I'm like, the pressure's on, right? He's reading the wrong gospel. He reads the gospel, which is the same story, but he reads the gospel after the conversation with Martha. He picks up the gospel where Jesus goes, and there's a crowd. There's friends of Lazarus. There's family members of Lazarus. There are neighbors of Lazarus. There are Pharisees. There are Sadducees. There are people who worked with Lazarus there. And there are his sisters. And they're all crying. And Jesus, the gospel says, when he sees these people and how sad they are, how moved they are, he is moved himself with compassion, right? And he's moved with compassion because he's moved by their sadness. He's moved by their tears. And Jesus has a moment of extraordinary compassion that he does something very, very rare. Because Jesus cured thousands of blind people. Jesus cleansed thousands of lepers. Jesus did a lot of miracles, cured a lot of paralytics. But there's only 2 moments in all the Gospels where Jesus takes, 3 moments where Jesus takes a dead person and brings them back to life. Okay? Thousands of paralytics, thousands of lepers, thousands of blind people, but only 3 times throughout his 3-year career as a miracle worker, only 3 times that he raises people from the dead. By the way, he doesn't resurrect them, he reanimates them, because resurrection is a different story. When you're resurrected, the resurrection is a little different. It's permanent. It's always. Jesus resurrects, and we're going to resurrect after we die. Lazarus wasn't resurrected. He was actually reanimated. He was brought back to his original state, went back to work, hung out with his sisters, that kind of situation. He does that 3 times. He does that with a little girl who dies, and Jesus says, oh, no, she's just sleeping, and brings her back. He does that with Lazarus. In this case, he does that as well. And he does it also with the widow of Naim, whose son dies. She's left alone, and Jesus is moved with such compassion. He's moved with such compassion for her that without even asking, he reanimates this person. I hope you remember that story because it's a very beautiful story. It's one of the few times that Jesus does a miracle without being asked. Most of the time you have to ask. Jesus, I'm blind. Can you cure me? Do you believe that I can? Yes, I can. Okay, bam, you're cured. But rarely does Jesus come in and see a blind guy go, boom, boom, you're cured. And the guy's like, I didn't ask for that. You have to ask. That's the case. That's the case. I don't know if you ever watched Monty Python. I may not recommend it for the kids right now, but if you've ever seen it, there's a movie, Monty Python did a movie called Life of Brian. Incredibly horrible and insulting to any person who is a Christian. But I was told by my father not to watch it, so of course I watched it when I was a kid. And there's a scene which I find very funny. That as Jesus and the apostles are walking around, there's this one character that keeps coming back really pissed off. It says Jesus terrible and Jesus is no good and that guy Jesus of Nazareth is terrible. You end up finding out that this guy was blind and was a beggar. Jesus cures him of his blindness, and now that he can see, nobody wants to give him money. And so now he's like, now I'm starving because I got no money because I can see now, right? So Jesus in the scriptures only cures when you ask him to. The paralytic who's at the well, with the water, he goes, why are you here? Every time I try to go in there, I can't. He goes, do you want to be cured? And the guy says, yes, I want to be cured. Jesus cures him. Naim is the only time that Jesus, nobody asked anything, the woman didn't say anything, the friends didn't say anything, the Pharisees, nobody asked for anything. Jesus goes, moved by compassion, brings the guy back. Okay? Jesus, in the case, when the deacon reads the gospel, reads the wrong gospel, he's reading the part where Jesus goes to the tomb. Where have they laid him? He's over there. He goes there and he looks. Friends of Lazarus are crying. Neighbors of Lazarus are crying. People who work with Lazarus are crying. Pharisees are there crying. Sadducees are crying. Priests are crying. Martha's crying. Mary's crying. Jesus cries, and moved with compassion, he says, remove the stone. No, don't do that, because he's been there already for 4 days. He's going to smell. Remove the stone. Lazarus come out. Lazarus comes out. They unbind him. Everybody's happy. Moved with compassion of seeing all these people, the miracle takes place. Hope is returned. That's what this guy's reading. And instead of listening to the gospel and being really soaking it in as to the power of this gospel, I'm upset at the deacon. Because the homily that I had prepared, I was moved with anger, not compassion. Because the homily that I had prepared in the presence of all these people, 95% of which I knew, was now out the window. What the hell was I going to do? And here's the thing, because the Holy Spirit is never going to miss out on an opportunity to teach me and everybody else a very important lesson. When the gospel finishes and the deacon sits down and he sits next to me, I'm looking at the guy like going, you suck, dude. But I didn't, of course, because we're in Mass. I get up to the altar and I bow and I look up and I stand there, and as I'm looking out into the crowd, I notice something very interesting. I noticed that Ian, my brother-in-law, present at the funeral mass was my family. Present was Ian's family. Present were Ian's co-workers. He worked for an IT company. Present were also the members of the parish where his father was a deacon. They were there. Present also were the members of his fraternity. He belonged to a musical fraternity from FIU. They were there. And present also were the people who worked with my sister. There were 6 different communities represented there. And it hit me. I'm telling you, like on the spot, it hit me. Oh my God. It's like the friends of Lazarus, the co-workers of Lazarus, the neighbors of Lazarus, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, this community. And I look into their faces, and it shot me back 2,000 years to when possibly the tears and the sadness and the burden of having lost this young person that they loved very much. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, I am moved at this very moment with the compassion of these people for my sister and for my brother-in-law who's passed away. And what I felt the Spirit tell me, and what the Spirit spoke through me, was to say, the hope that Jesus, who has the power even over death, the hope that gives us is not simply in the miracle of raising somebody from the dead. It's also the hope of knowing that you belong to a community who is moved by your sadness and moved by your desolation, and can, in a moment of such difficulty, can be your support, can be there to accompany you and to cry with you and to help you and to prepare food for you because you're going through this very difficult moment, and can tell you, listen, don't worry, you could take a month off work, recover, take your time. who can be this support. This is where the hope of Jesus comes through. Because at the end of the day, Ian is not back. He's dead. But the hope of Jesus, not only in the resurrection, but also the hope that is portrayed through the real presence of these people who got in a line and for an hour and a half waited to be able to embrace my sister and tell her how much they love her and how whatever she needs, please let them know. By the way, I swear to you, that came to me at that very moment. I hadn't prepared that. And it's almost as if those 2 or 3 days that I spent preparing for this homily, I was preparing for it. And the whole time Jesus was saying, piensa todo lo que tú quieras, pero va a ser una cosa diferente el día de la misa. And all of a sudden, you get up there, and if you allow, and that's why there's a part in the scriptures where Jesus sends the apostles out, and the apostles say, Lord, what are we going to say? And Jesus says, don't worry about what you're going to say. The Holy Spirit, He will come into your hearts and your minds, and you will speak what He wants you to say. And you're thinking to yourself, oh, that's the Bible. Listen, I am living proof of the fact that these things happen, and they happen to me pretty often. And it's also living proof of the fact that just when you think things are wrong, a mistake was made, little do you know that that mistake is only an opportunity for something even greater to happen. Because I kind of get the impression that if I would have preached the homily that I had prepared, it may not have been as powerful as the one that was actually preached, because it's the one that the Spirit wanted to preach. By the way, that was not what I intended to say. That was a digression, because I was telling you that I oftentimes get, as you can see, my 15 minutes are up and I haven't even gotten to what I wanted to talk to you about. So let me just move into that really quick, because I wasn't, what really called me this time was like, I told Eric, Eric, I know I'm going to say a few words, but I'm wondering what I should talk about. And he gave me a couple of ideas. But what actually hit me yesterday as I was driving home, I went to the varsity football game last night, which we lost, unfortunately, over at Traspal Stadium. And that's a long drive. So I was driving back from Traspal Stadium, and I'm thinking to myself, what am I going to talk about? And I realized that today was the feast of St. Luke. So I said, well, maybe something about Luke. But as you can see in the homily, I already talked to you a little bit about, who St. Luke was. I failed to mention that, and I don't know if you know this, but Luke is not only the author of the Gospel of St. Luke, but he's also the author of the Acts of the Apostles. So that first book of the Bible after the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, first book after that is Acts of the Apostles. And it's a really cool book, because it's one of those books that very beautifully mixes both historical reality and fact in a good chronological order, and kind of introduces you to what the first Christian communities did after Jesus took off, and also very profound theology of how there is a continuation from the message of Jesus to the apostles. I don't know if you heard the Eucharistic prayer that I said in Mass today, talks about how our faith is founded upon the rock, which were the apostles. And I don't know if you know this, which I find very cool. When Pope Benedict XVI was Pope, right? John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI. A lot of people didn't like Benedict XVI because he doesn't have the same warm, fuzzy personality as John Paul II. John Paul was a good-looking guy. He was an athlete. He was an actor. He was young and looked young even when he was old, except for the last part of his life where, he was looking bad because he was dealing with Parkinson's. Very dynamic, very charismatic. No pope in the history of the Catholic Church had ever traveled as much as John Paul II, and he was my hero. My hero. I can tell you that one of the reasons why I'm a priest today, one of the main reasons why I'm a priest today, is because of John Paul II. And I remember back in 1987, I was a senior at Belen, and John Paul II came to visit Miami, and we all went to Tamiami Park, right, for the Mass. And I don't know if you were there or if you know about it, but there was a huge lightning storm, and everybody took off. And we decided, because we were the Belen guys, my classmates and I, we were like, hey, lightning, ¿qué es eso? Nothing's going to happen, whatever. And we stayed right there, and we were actually rewarded. Because after everybody took off, he actually came back. And there were like a handful of us that were there. Front row seats, John Paul II. It was like, a rock star, right? Kind of situation. Very inspiring. Pobrecito, Benedict XVI comes in. He's 100 years old, right? He's an intellectual. And to top it all off, he's German, right? He's got the scowl, like a Nazi guard or something, right? You took pictures of Pope John Paul II, and even in the most horrible of situations, John Paul II had a glow. He was very photogenic. Benedict was not photogenic at all. You take a picture of Pope Benedict XVI, and he looked mean. He looked angry every single time. So people were like, oh man, this guy sucks, dude. John Paul II's the best. This guy's terrible. I love Benedict XVI. Love. And not because he's photogenic, because he's not. Not because he's charismatic, because he's not. But I love Benedict XVI because he is the most extraordinary writer. You got to understand Benedict XVI, you got to read him, not see him or listen to him. You got to read him. One of the most powerful books I've ever read in my life, most powerful books I've ever read in my life, and I've been reading for a long time, is he came out with a trilogy called Jesus of Nazareth. And he covers the life of Jesus from beginning to the end and the implications of that life. I've read that book on retreats, and I've read that book also when not on retreat. The theology in those books is so powerful that it blows my mind. As a matter of fact, I read them and I say to myself, why isn't everybody a Catholic? Because this all makes so much sense to me. And he tells me things that I never even knew. And I had studied theology for 4 years. I was a priest, and I'm learning new things from this guy. You want to understand Benedict XVI? Read him. Read him, and read these books. Look, you got to take it slow, because it's like every time you read a chapter, it's like taking a mouthful of food. You just got to stop, put your fork and your knife down, and then just chew, 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 swallow, drink some water, then read the next chapter. Anyways, he got criticized very heavily by the world. By the world. Both Christian and non-Christian. He got criticized because he started wearing red shoes. I don't know if you remember this. Right? The red shoes. And as a matter of fact, everybody started criticizing because they said, oh, he's wearing Prada. Let me tell you, for what it's worth, it wasn't Prada. Because the Vatican has its own cobbler. I didn't even know cobblers existed anymore. The Vatican has a cobbler. It's not Prada. It was Luigi, whatever his name was, who's the cobbler over in the Vatican. So that's not true. It wasn't Prada. It was the cobbler of the Vatican who made the shoes, but specifically asked by Benedict XVI for them to be red. And people were like saying, oh, this guy, no sé qué cosa, and these red, fluffy shoes and all that stuff. See, the thing that amazes me about Benedict XVI is that he's not willing to throw out the window a very beautiful, powerful message simply because you don't get it. Because the reason why he's doing that is because the scriptures tell us that the Catholic Church is built upon the blood of the apostles. The Catholic Church is built upon the blood, stands upon that blood of those men who died for the sake of the faith. And think about how incredible this is. Jesus had 12 apostles. One betrayed him, but they replaced him. Of those 12 apostles, 11 of them were martyred. They were skinned alive. They were beheaded. They were crucified. Okay? And that's significant. Because if they would have chosen to not be martyred, if they would have buckled at the moment of truth, we wouldn't be here today. We'd either be Jewish or anything else. But we wouldn't be Catholic. We wouldn't be Christians. But because these men shed their blood, the Catholic Church has survived and will continue to survive. So what does he do? He wears the red shoes because it's a powerful symbol. I'm the Pope, right? I'm the first among billions of Catholics, and I understand that my church stands upon the blood of the martyrs. That was the significance of the red shoes, right? Benedict XVI, which is a very powerful thing. Now, Luke writes the Acts of the Apostles and talks about how they gave their life, how they were martyred, how Peter was killed, how all these people were killed, right? And how many of them died. First of the apostles to die was actually St. James, the one that has the Camino de Santiago. First one that dies is St. James. He gets beheaded by Herod. He goes out to Spain, to Finisterra, ends up coming back because Mary tells him, you need to come back. He comes back, and the whole thing happens. So I said, you know what? Let me continue with the Luke theme. And finally, I have a right to what I wanted to say. 2 or 3 weeks ago, if you were at Mass on Sundays, and hopefully you were, they read what I find to be one of the most moving passages in the Gospel of St. Luke, and that's chapter 15 of St. Luke. And chapter 15 of St. Luke tells 3 very interesting parables, 3 very interesting stories. And I got to tell you, I've struggled with these throughout the years. But in preparation for my homily 3 weeks ago and listening to a couple of commentators on it, there were some things that I never thought about that I find very beautiful and I wanted to share with you. And the 3 parables, and hopefully you remember them, is Jesus tells the parable about, number 1, a woman who loses a coin. And when she loses the coin, she turns the house upside down, sweeps all the floors and all the corners of the house until she finds the coin. And then the parable says that after she finds a coin, she runs outside, calls her neighbors, and she says, let's have a party because I have found this coin that I have lost. Parable number 1. Do you remember that? Parable number 2. The story of the lost sheep. It's like a shepherd who has 99 sheep, has 100 sheep, and one of them gets lost. He takes the 99, puts them in the corral, and he goes to look for the one lost sheep. And when he finds the sheep, he puts that sheep on his shoulders, takes him back to the others, and there's rejoicing for that one lost sheep that's been found. Parable number 3, the prodigal son. This is probably the most famous one of the 3, right? There's an old man who has 2 kids. One of them, the younger one, says to his father, you are dead to me. Give to me my inheritance, what is coming to me. Because basically that's what that means. You're saying you're dead to me. The old man doesn't hesitate, gives him the money. The guy takes off. Distant lands, squanders it on wild women, gambling, whining and dining. Money runs out. There's a famine. He's hungry, hires himself out to tend to pigs, which for a Jew was incredibly humiliating, and they were impure animals, so they weren't supposed to even touch them, and here he was feeding them. And how he longed to feed himself even on the corn husks that were fed to the pigs, but he couldn't. And then, as you know, he says, why am I here? My father has a lot of employees, got all this food, I'm going to go back. And as he's going back, he's rehearsing what he's going to say to his dad. Father, I have sinned against you and your house, and I am not worthy to come back, but I ask you to take me back, even if it's as a hired hand. The story goes on to tell us that the old man sees the son at a distance, runs out to him. And when the kid begins to say, Father, I have sinned against you, before he even gets the words out of his mouth, the old man says, hugs him and says, bring sandals for his feet and rings for his finger, because my son, who I thought was dead, is now alive. Let's have a party. They take the fatted calf, which, by the way, he had been fattening for this very occasion, right? Put it to the side because he knew one day he was going to come back. Takes the fatted calf that they had been working on, slaughters it. They have this party. But Luke tells you a pretty cool thing is that there's another part to that story, which is the older brother is outside, doesn't want to come into the party. So the old man goes out to see him. He says, dude, come on in. He says, no, it's not fair. I've always been faithful. I've always been here. I've never abandoned you. I've never left you. I haven't asked you for anything, not even for a little goat to share with my friends. And this brother of mine who took off and squandered all your money, a sinner, a terrible person, you bring him back and you hug him and you kiss him and you give him a party. And the old man says, everything that I have is yours. Everything. But your brother, he was lost and now he's found. We have to celebrate. Come into the house. Do you know how the story ends? Do you know what the older brother does? Well, the answer is you don't, because the gospel doesn't tell you. It dramatically ends it there. Ta-da! The end. You're like, oh, you have to wait for next season. They'll tell you. But the reason why Luke does that, it's a literary art. The reason why Jesus does that and Luke portrays it that way is because that's the question that is left to you. Do you go in or do you stay out? Okay? So those are the 3 parables. Interesting parables. There's one common thread and then 3 things that are a little different. And that's what I wanted to share with you very quickly. I think the first thing that we have to emphasize here is something that I find extraordinary. See, we have a misconception when it comes to our relationship with God. We are convinced that we have to work very hard to search for God in our lives. That we have to look for Him. That we have to go out and find Him. And that we have to place ourselves in the right situations in order to be able to find Him. We have to go to church in order to be able to find him. We got to go to confession in order to be able to find him. We have to search for God. One of my favorite painters, a local painter, that I know her personally, that's why I think the reason why I like her so much, is a woman by the name of Sacasas. Have you ever heard of Sacasas? She's a very famous Miami painter. And I don't know if you know this about Sacasas, and if you walk into any Cuban's home, there's a painting of Sacasas. And if you go to my office, I have a huge painting that she did specifically for me when I became president of the school. Sacasas does something very interesting. She says, I have spent my whole life searching for God. And so what she does in her paintings is she always, in every single painting she has ever done, she includes a little cross. But she hides it. She hides it. Because she says that, like my life as a Christian, always searching for God, sometimes God is hidden and you have to look for him. You have to search for him. Confident that he's there, but you got to look for him. And so when the kids come into my office, I normally tell them, look, there's a cross hidden in there. You got to look for it. It's a great tool for teaching. But I got to tell you that that's not what the Gospel of St. Luke tells us. As a matter of fact, most of the Bible does not talk about the fact that the way that the individual lives his Christian life is searching for God. It actually has everything to do with God looking for you. See, the fact is that we think that it's on us and that we have to go searching because God has left or God has abandoned or God has hidden himself. And so I have to go looking for him. And that's not what the Bible says. We made that up. We made it up because we have kind of like this, go get 'em mentality where it's on us and we have to carry the shoulder, the burden, and go looking. No. The Bible tells us from beginning to end that God comes looking for us. God's existence is a constant search and looking for you. Now, what's on you is you have to allow yourself to be found. See, that's the key. You have to allow yourself to be found. Go to Genesis. When Adam and Eve commit the sin, according to the story that they tell us, they're hiding. And the story is very beautiful because the way that it's portrayed is the author tells you that God is walking through the garden looking for Adam and Eve, screaming out, Adam, Eve, where are you? And then fortunately, Adam comes out of hiding and allows himself to be found. This is what being a man of faith is all about. Allowing yourself to be found by God. Because God is searching. He's always looking for you. He's always looking for us. And we hide away many, many times. That's what sin is all about. We close the door of our room and we sin, escondido. That's why people hate confession. Because confession means opening up, and could be for many people, it's a humiliating experience to have to expose ourselves and allow God to find us, not where we should be, but allow God to find us where we are. That's the key. So take into consideration as the first point of reference of these three stories is God looks for you. The woman looks for the coin, the shepherd looks for the sheep, and in the story of the prodigal son, the old man goes out to the son. Because I'm telling you, if it was my dad, he'd sit at home and say, que venga aquí y que me pida perdón. Not God. As a matter of fact, the way I interpret the story, that old man must have been sitting at that window every single day looking out into the horizon. And the moment that he saw the sun coming, he took off running. Because God searched for you. He's always looking for you. That's number one. But then here's the thing, which I find very interesting. What's been lost? See, the prodigal son I get. He's your child, right? And there's a love there. And there's an unconditional love. And the idea of being going able to search the son. But I listened to the story of the old woman looking for the coin. It makes no sense to me. As a matter of fact, I read that, I'm saying to myself, esa tipa está loca. Because the way that it's portrayed in the gospel, the coin that the woman loses is of very little value. It's a denarii. It's less than 5 cents. And all of a sudden, she turns the house upside down looking for that. I mean, the couches in our homes are probably packed with change, and you many times don't even go in there to take it out. You don't go searching for 5 cents like it's the end of the world, and this woman does. She goes searching the whole house, turning things upside down, sweeping all over the place. And not only does she do that, which in my opinion is crazy, but when she finds a coin, the story tells you, very weird, because even for that time it's weird, she runs out, calls her neighbors, and she says, we're going to have a great party. I found 5 cents. If I were a neighbor, I would have said, "Ta tipa está loca, dude. She's crazy. What are you talking about? You're having a party because you found a denarii, you found 5 cents? This woman is NVTS nuts, like Mel Brooks says in the History of the World. Crazy. Crazy. And then, the story about the sheep. Makes no sense to me either. If I am a shepherd and I have 100 sheep, and I have 99 of them, and one of them gets lost, and the story says that he leaves 99 by themselves to go out looking for the one, mathematically, it makes no sense to me whatsoever. As a matter of fact, the gospel says, which person would not go out there to search for the lost sheep? If I was there in the time of Jesus, I would have gone, me. It makes no sense whatsoever. You're going to jeopardize the 99 for the sake of this one? No. That sheep, put it in the lost column. We run businesses. Sometimes you got to take this as a loss and that's it, but you move forward because there's a greater advantage of something else. So it makes no sense to me. It's not practical. It's not practical at all. So I don't agree. No, it's not practical. That would make no sense. If I was a shepherd, me quedo con las 99. That little one, bueno, se fastidió. No big deal. And then, of course, the prodigal son. Because again, I say my father, but I got to tell you, me too. I would have been waiting there. Y con el cinturón en la mano. Ven para acá. Fuágata. Right over the head. I remember that when I was a kid growing up, it's a funny story. My little sister got a big wheel, little pink one with little tassels on the side. And I looked out the window of my house and I see my father like pushing her, because she was tiny, pushing her like this. And my sister, So I run out there and I tell my dad, hey, let me push her. And my dad says, no, porque es muy pequeñita. No, I can do it. He goes, okay, go slow. So I put my hands on my sister's shoulders and I start pushing. I'm thinking to myself, this is so boring. So I take off with my sister. The pedals hitting my sister's feet. Ting, 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 ting. And finally, all of a sudden, I hear my father in the background. And I just keep going. And all of a sudden, there's a break in the sidewalk. And I hit the brake. My sister goes flying in that direction. The big wheel goes in the other. And I tumble on the ground. And I turn around to look, because my concern wasn't my sister. My concern was me. And I turn around to look at my father. And I swear to you, like in the movies, in slow motion, I see my father running. And as he's running, he trips. And he falls. And he scrapes on the sidewalk. And he rolls over like this, my father. Well, you know what I did, right? I ran away. I ran away. I waited. This must have been like 10 o'clock in the morning. The sun's coming down. And I finally say, it's time to go back. So I go back to my house. I say to myself, my father, calm down. Everything's okay. I'll talk to him. I'll apologize. I get to the house. I open the door. I walk in. And standing behind the door was my father. And he hit me. Pop, right across the head. Oh, you idiota. Look at that. Screaming at me, kicking me as I'm going into my room, right? I hope I'm painting a picture like in your houses. I hope I'm not the only one who goes through an experience like that. It's funny because many years later, I see my father and joking around, I tell people, no, because when he used to hit us with the belt, my father's like, I never hit you with a belt. I was like, seriously? Is this Alzheimer's already? Because seriously, Maya, you had them hanging like in a row. Let me see. I'll take the brown one today. That's not the story that you hear in the prodigal. That's not my experience of a father necessarily. The disciplinarian who says, no, wait till he gets here, and then I'm going to kick his ass, and then I'm going to ground him for a year. Okay? Ground him for a year. That's not what we see here. So I see a woman who is crazy, a shepherd who is impractical, and I see an old man who's weak. That's what I see. A woman who's crazy, a shepherd who's impractical, and an old man who is weak. That's what I see. But see, that's not what God sees. God's love for us is so immeasurable. It's so powerful. It's so unconditional that his perspective is very different. And I think that what the gospel is trying to tell us is that, yes, it's that crazy, stupid love. It's like when you're growing up as a kid and you fall in love for the first time and you realize that sometimes you do irrational things because you're in love. You know, when I fell in love with Claudia Suarez, I was in 11th grade at Belen when I fell in love with Claudia Suarez, and I was convinced that I was going to marry Claudia Suarez. And I remember that on the day of her birthday, I drove my 1972 Volkswagen Bug to her house at 5 o'clock in the morning. And I had taken rose petals, and I had placed them on the hood of her car, and tied balloons to the side windows, side mirrors, and put a card, "Happy birthday, I love you, Claudia." And I drove back. And my father says to me, ¿dónde tú estabas tan temprano por la mañana? Digo, no, que hoy es el cumpleaños de Claudia Suárez y le fui a dejar unos regalitos en el carro sin ella saberlo. And my father says, ¿qué come mierda? It's crazy, stupid love. It's not practical. Sometimes love is not practical. But the love of the woman that's crazy, the love of the shepherd that's impractical, and the love of the old man that seems weak is actually where the power of God resides. Of course, it may not be practical. Of course, it may seem irrational. But that's unconditional love that God has for us. He's searching, He's seeking, He's looking all the time for you. You hit Him and He comes back at you. You offend Him and He takes you back. And it's so difficult for us to understand it. You know why? Because we're riddled with pride. And God has none of it. None of it. And that's what the story is trying to tell us. That's what Luke is trying to communicate. It explains why Jesus was willing to die. It explains why the martyrs were willing to die. It's not practical. As a matter of fact, I have people tell me, it's amazing. When I tell the stories to the kids about the martyrs, especially the Jesuit martyrs, they always say, but if they would have denied Jesus at that one moment, just said it, they would have survived longer. They could have done more work. And I confess to you that I've thought of that too. If Miguel Pro, the Jesuit martyr in Mexico, if he would have just said to the authorities, no, I'm sorry, I promise I'll never talk about Jesus again, that was just stupid or whatever, and would have left with his life, he could have kept doing more work, but he didn't. As a matter of fact, he felt that was the best way to tell the world that he was convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus was God, that Jesus loved us. It may not be practical. It may not be practical, but it's very true. And that's what love does. Impractical, irrational, crazy stuff. But man, it may seem like you're weak, but that's exactly what God is talking about. And that's what we need to experience as well. That's it, guys. Thank you very much.